Book 1, Chapter 13 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wang Anqi. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. Book 1, Chapter 13. Father Benwell's Correspondence. 1. Arthur Penrose to Father Benwell. Reverend and dear Father, when I last had the honor of seeing you, I received your instructions to report, by letter, the result of my conversations on religion with Mr. Romayne. As events have turned out, it is needless to occupy your time by dwelling at any length on this subject, in writing. Mr. Romayne has been strongly impressed by the excellent books which I have introduced to his notice. He raises certain objections, which I have done my best to meet, and he promises to consider my arguments with his closest attention, in the time to come. I am happier in the hope of restoring his mental tranquillity, in other and worthier words, of effecting his conversion, than I can tell you in any words of mine. I respect and admire, I may almost say I love, Mr. Romayne. The details which are wanting in this brief report of progress, I shall have the privilege of personally relating to you. Mr. Romayne no longer desires to conceal himself from his friends. He received a letter this morning which has changed all his plans, and has decided him on immediately returning to London. I am not acquainted with the contents of the letter, or with the name of the writer, but I am pleased, for Mr. Romayne's sake, to see that the reading of it has made him happy. By tomorrow evening I hope to present my respects to you. 2. Mr. Birtrick to Father Benwell. Sir, the inquiries which I have instituted at your request have proved successful in one respect. I am in a position to tell you that events in Mr. Winterfield's life have unquestionably connected him with a young lady named Miss Stella Eyrecourt. The attendant circumstances, however, are not so easy to discover. Judging by the careful report of the person whom I employ, there must have been serious reasons, in this case, for keeping facts secret and witnesses out of the way. I mention this not to discourage you, but to prepare you for delays that may occur on our way to discovery. Be pleased to preserve your confidence in me, and to give me time, and I answer for the result. End of Chapter 13. Recording by Wang Anqi. End of Book 1.
The Story, Book the Second, Chapter 1 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the Second, Chapter 1. The Sandwich Dance. A fine spring, after a winter of unusual severity, promised well for the prospects of the London season. Among the social entertainments of the time, general curiosity was excited in the little sphere which absurdly describes itself under the big name of society, by the announcement of a party to be given by Lady Loring, bearing the quaint title of a sandwich dance. The invitations were issued at an unusually early hour, and it was understood that nothing so solid and so commonplace as the customary supper was to be offered to the guests. In a word, Lady Loring's ball was designed as a bold protest against late hours and heavy midnight meals. The younger people were all in favor of the proposed reform. Their elders declined to give an opinion beforehand. In the small inner circle of Lady Loring's most intimate friends, it was whispered that an innovation in the matter of refreshments was contemplated, which would put the tolerant principles of the guests to a severe test. Miss Notman, the housekeeper, politely threatening retirement on a small annuity since the memorable affair of the oyster omelette, decided on carrying out her design when she heard that there was to be no supper. "My attachment to the family can bear a great deal," she said. "But when Lady Loring deliberately gives a ball without a supper, I must hide my head somewhere, and it had better be out of the house." Taking Miss Notman as a representative of a class, the reception of the coming experiment looked, to say the least of it, doubtful. On the appointed evening, the guests made one agreeable discovery when they entered the reception rooms. They were left perfectly free to amuse themselves as they liked. The drawing rooms were given up to dancing, the picture gallery was devoted to chamber music. Chess players and card players found remote and quiet rooms especially prepared for them. People who cared for nothing but talking were accommodated to perfection in a sphere of their own; and lovers, in earnest or not in earnest, discovered, in a dimly lighted conservatory with many recesses, that ideal of discreet retirement which combines solitude and society under one roof. But the ordering of the refreshments failed, as had been foreseen, to share in the approval conferred on the arrangement of the rooms. The first impression was unfavorable. Lady Loring, however, knew enough of human nature to leave results to two potent allies, experience and time. Except in the conservatory, the astonished guests could go nowhere without discovering tables prettily decorated with flowers, and bearing hundreds of little pure white china plates, loaded with nothing but sandwiches. All varieties of opinion were consulted. People of ordinary tastes, who liked to know what they were eating, could choose conventional beef or ham, encased in thin slices of bread of a delicate flavor quite new to them. Other persons, less easily pleased, were tempted by sandwiches of pate de foie gras, and by exquisite combinations of chicken and truffles, reduced to a creamy pulp which clung to the bread like butter. Foreigners, making experiments, and not averse to garlic, discovered the finest sausages of Germany and Italy transformed into English sandwiches. Anchovies and sardines appealed, in the same unexpected way, to men who desired to create an artificial thirst, after having first ascertained that the champagne was something to be fondly remembered and regretted at other parties to the end of the season. The hospitable profusion of the refreshments was all pervading and inexhaustible. Wherever the guests might be, or however they were amusing themselves, there were the pretty little white plates perpetually tempting them. People ate as they had never ate before, and even the inveterate English prejudice against anything new was conquered at last. Universal opinion declared the sandwich dance to be an admirable idea, perfectly carried out. Many of the guests paid their hostess the compliment of arriving at the early hour mentioned in the invitations. One of them was Major Hynd. Lady Loring took her first opportunity of speaking to him apart. "I hear you were a little angry," she said, "when you were told that Miss Eyrecourt had taken your inquiries out of your hands." "I thought it rather a bold proceeding, Lady Loring," the Major replied. "But as the General's widow turned out to be a lady in the best sense of the word, Miss Eyrecourt's romantic adventure has justified itself. I wouldn't recommend her to run the same risk a second time." "I suppose you know what Romayne thinks of it?" "Not yet. I have been too busy to call on him since I have been in town. Pardon me, Lady Loring, who is that beautiful creature in the pale yellow dress? Surely I have seen her somewhere before." "That beautiful creature, Major, is the bold young lady of whose conduct you don't approve." "Miss Eyrecourt?" "Yes." "I retract everything I said," cried the Major, quite shamelessly. "Such a woman as that may do anything. She is looking this way. Pray introduce me." The Major was introduced, and Lady Loring returned to her guests. "I think we have met before, Major Hynd," said Stella. Her voice supplied the missing link in the Major's memory of events. Remembering how she had looked at Romayne on the deck of the steamboat, he began dimly to understand Miss Eyrecourt's otherwise incomprehensible anxiety to be of use to the General's family. I remember perfectly, he answered. It was on the passage from Boulogne to Folkestone, and my friend was with me. You and he have no doubt met since that time?" He put the question as a mere formality. The unexpressed thought in him was, "Another of them in love with Romayne, and nothing as usual likely to come of it."
"I hope you have forgiven me for going to Camp's Hill in your place," said Stella.
"I ought to be grateful to you," the Major rejoined. "No time has been lost in relieving these poor people, and your powers of persuasion have succeeded where mine might have failed. Has Romayne been to see them himself since his return to London?"
"No, he desires to remain unknown, and he is kindly content for the present to be represented by me."
"For the present," Major Hynd repeated. A faint flush passed over her delicate complexion.
"I have succeeded," she resumed, "in inducing Madame Marillac to accept the help offered through me to her son. The poor creature is safe, under kind superintendence, in a private asylum. So far, I can do no more."
"Will the mother accept nothing?"
"Nothing, either for herself or her daughter, so long as they can work. I cannot tell you how patiently and beautifully she speaks of her hard lot. But her health may give way, and it is possible before long that I may leave London." She paused, the flush deepened on her face. "The failure of the mother's health may happen in my absence," she continued, "and Mr. Romayne will ask you to look after the family, from time to time, while I am away."
"I will do it with pleasure, Miss Eyrecourt. Is Romayne likely to be here to night?" She smiled brightly, and looked away. The Major's curiosity was excited. He looked in the same direction. There was Romayne, entering the room, to answer for himself. What was the attraction which drew the unsocial student to an evening party? Major Hynd's eyes were on the watch. When Romayne and Stella shook hands, the attraction stood self revealed to him, in Miss Eyrecourt. Recalling the momentary confusion which she had betrayed when she spoke of possibly leaving London, and of Romayne's plans for supplying her place as his almoner, the Major, with military impatience of delays, jumped to a conclusion. "I was wrong," he thought. "My impenetrable friend is touched in the right place at last. When the splendid creature in yellow leaves London, the name on her luggage will be Mrs. Romayne." "You are looking quite another man, Romayne," he said mischievously, "since we met last." Stella gently moved away, leaving them to talk freely. Romayne took no advantage of the circumstance to admit his old friend to his confidence. Whatever relations might really exist between Miss Eyrecourt and himself were evidently kept secret thus far. "My health has been a little better lately," was the only reply he made. The Major dropped his voice to a whisper. "Have you not had any return?" he began. Romayne stopped him there. "I don't want my infirmities made public," he whispered back irritably. "Look at the people all round us. When I tell you I have been better lately, you ought to know what it means." "Any discoverable reason for the improvement?" persisted the Major, still bent on getting evidence in support of his own private conclusions. "None," Romayne answered sharply. But Major Hynd was not to be discouraged by sharp replies. "Miss Eyrecourt and I have been recalling our first meeting on board the steamboat," he went on. "Do you remember how indifferent you were to that beautiful person when I asked you if you knew her? I am glad to see that you show better taste to night. I wish I knew her well enough to shake hands as you did." "Hynd, when a young man talks nonsense, his youth is his excuse. At your time of life you have passed the excusable age, even in the estimation of your friends." With those words Romayne turned away. The incorrigible Major instantly met the reproof inflicted on him with a smart answer. "Remember," he said, "that I was the first of your friends to wish you happiness." He too turned away, in the direction of the champagne and the sandwiches. Meanwhile Stella had discovered Penrose, lost in the brilliant assemblage of guests, standing alone in a corner. It was enough for her that Romayne's secretary was also Romayne's friend. Passing by titled and celebrated personages, all anxious to speak to her, she joined the shy, nervous, sad-looking little man, and did all she could to set him at his ease. "I am afraid, Mr. Penrose, this is not a very attractive scene to you." Having said those kind words, she paused. Penrose was looking at her confusedly, but with an expression of interest which was new to her experience of him. "Has Romayne told him?" she wondered inwardly. "It is a very beautiful scene, Miss Eyrecourt," he said in his low, quiet tones. "Did you come here with Mr. Romayne?" she asked. "Yes. It was by his advice that I accepted the invitation with which Lady Loring has honored me. I am sadly out of place in such an assembly as this, but I would make far greater sacrifices to please Mr. Romayne." She smiled kindly. Attachment so artlessly devoted to the man she loved pleased and touched her. In her anxiety to discover a subject which might interest him, she overcame her antipathy to the spiritual director of the household. "Is Father Benwell coming to us to night?" she inquired. "He will certainly be here, Miss Eyrecourt, if he can get back to London in time." "Has he been long away?" "Nearly a week." Not knowing what else to say, she still paid Penrose the compliment of feigning an interest in Father Benwell. "Has he a long journey to make in returning to London?" she asked. "Yes, all the way from Devonshire." "From South Devonshire?" "No, North Devonshire, Clovelly." The smile suddenly left her face. She put another question, without quite concealing the effort that it cost her, or the anxiety for which she waited for the reply. "I know something of the neighborhood of Clovelly," she said. "I wonder whether Father Benwell is visiting any friends of mine there?" "I am not able to say, Miss Eyrecourt. The Reverend Father's letters are forwarded to the hotel. I know no more than that." With a gentle inclination of her head, she turned toward other guests, looked back, and with a last little courteous attention offered to him, said, "If you like music, Mr. Penrose, I advise you to go to the picture gallery. They are going to play a quartet by Mozart." Penrose thanked her, noticing that her voice and manner had become strangely subdued. She made her way back to the room in which the hostess received her guests. Lady Loring was, for the moment, alone, resting on a sofa. Stella stooped over her, and spoke in cautiously lowered tones. "If Father Benwell comes here to night," she said, "try to find out what he has been doing at Clovelly." "Clovelly?" Lady Loring repeated. "Is that the village near Winterfield's house?" "Yes." End of chapter 1. Read by Lars Rolander. The Story, Book the Second, Chapter 2 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the Second, Chapter 2. The Question of Marriage. As Stella answered Lady Loring, she was smartly tapped on the shoulder by an eager guest with a fan. The guest was a very little woman, with twinkling eyes and a perpetual smile. Nature, corrected by powder and paint, was liberally displayed in her arms, her bosom, and the upper part of her back. Such clothes as she wore, defective perhaps in quantity, were in quality absolutely perfect. More adorable color, shape, and workmanship never appeared, even in a milliner's picture book. Her light hair was dressed with a fringe of ringlets, on the pattern which the portraits of the time of Charles II have made familiar to us. There was nothing exactly young or exactly old about her, except her voice, which betrayed a faint hoarseness, attributable possibly to exhaustion produced by untold years of incessant talking. It might be added that she was as active as a squirrel and as playful as a kitten, but the lady must be treated with a certain forbearance of tone, for this good reason: she was Stella's mother. Stella turned quickly at the tap of the fan. "Mamma!" she exclaimed, "how you startle me!" "My dear child," said Miss Eyrecourt, "you are constitutionally indolent, and you want startling. Go into the next room directly. Mr. Romayne is looking for you." Stella drew back a step, and eyed her mother in blank surprise. "Is it possible that you know him?" she asked. "Mr. Romayne doesn't go into society, or we should have met long since," Mrs. Eyrecourt replied. "He is a striking person, and I noticed him when he shook hands with you. That was quite enough for me. I have just introduced myself to him as your mother. He was a little stately and stiff, but most charming when he knew who I was. I volunteered to find you. He was quite astonished. I think he took me for your elder sister. Not the least like each other, are we, Lady Loring? She takes after her poor dear father. He was constitutionally indolent. My sweet child, rouse yourself. You have drawn a prize in a great lottery at last. If ever a man was in love, Mr. Romayne is that man. I am a physiognomist, Lady Loring, and I see the passions in the face. Oh, Stella, what a property! Vange Abbey, I once drove that way when I was visiting in the neighborhood. Superb! And another fortune, 12,000 a year, and a villa at Highgate, since the death of his aunt. And my daughter may be mistress of this if she only plays her cards properly. What a compensation, after all that we suffered through that monster Winterfield!" "Mamma, pray don't!" "Stella, I will not be interrupted when I am speaking to you for your own good. I don't know a more provoking person, Lady Loring, than my daughter, on certain occasions. And yet I love her. I would go through fire and water for my beautiful child. Only last week I was at a wedding, and I thought of Stella. The church was crammed to the doors, 100 at the wedding breakfast. The bride's lace there, no language can describe it. 10 bridesmaids, in blue and silver, reminded me of the 10 virgins, only the proportion of foolish ones this time was certainly more than 5. However, they looked well. The Archbishop proposed the health of the bride and bridegroom, so sweetly pathetic. Some of us cried. I thought of my daughter. Oh, if I could live to see Stella the central attraction, so to speak, of such a wedding as that! Only I would have 12 bridesmaids at least, and beat the blue and silver with green and gold. Trying to the complexion, you will say, but there are artificial improvements, at least I am told so. What a house this would be! A broad hint, isn't it, dear Lady Loring? What a house for a wedding, with the drawing room to assemble in, and the picture gallery for the breakfast. I know the Archbishop. My darling, he shall marry you. Why don't you go into the next room? Ah, that constitutional indolence! If you only had my energy, as I used to say to your poor father. Will you go? Yes, dear Lady Loring, I should like a glass of champagne, and another of those delicious chicken sandwiches. If you don't go, Stella, I shall forget every consideration of propriety, and, big as you are, I shall push you out. Stella yielded to necessity. "Keep her quiet, if you can," she whispered to Lady Loring in the moment of silence that followed. Even Mrs. Eyrecourt was not able to talk while she was drinking champagne. In the next room Stella found Romayne. He looked careworn and irritable, but brightened directly when she approached him. "My mother has been speaking to you," she said. "I am afraid—" He stopped her there. "She is your mother," he interposed kindly. "Don't think that I am ungrateful enough to forget that." She took his arm, and looked at him with all her heart in her eyes. "Come into a quieter room," she whispered. Romayne led her away. Neither of them noticed Penrose as they left the room. He had not moved since Stella had spoken to him. There he remained in his corner, absorbed in thought, and not in happy thought, as his face would have plainly betrayed to any one who had cared to look at him. His eyes sadly followed the retiring figures of Stella and Romayne. The color rose on his haggard cheeks. Like most men who are accustomed to live alone, he had the habit, when he was strongly excited, of speaking to himself. "No," he said, as the unacknowledged lovers disappeared through the door, "it is an insult to ask me to do it." He turned the other way, escaped Lady Loring's notice in the reception room, and left the house. Romayne and Stella passed through the card room and the chess room, turned into a corridor, and entered the conservatory. For the first time the place was a solitude. The air of a newly invented dance, faintly audible through the open windows of the ballroom above, had proved an irresistible temptation. Those who knew the dance were eager to exhibit themselves; those who had only heard of it were equally anxious to look on and learn. Even toward the latter end of the 19th century, the youths and maidens of society can still be in earnest when the object in view is a new dance. What would Major Hynd have said if he had seen Romayne turn into one of the recesses of the conservatory, in which there was a seat which just held two? But the Major had forgotten his years and his family, and he too was one of the spectators in the ballroom. "I wonder," said Stella, "whether you know how I feel those kind words of yours when you spoke of my mother. Shall I tell you?" She put her arm round his neck and kissed him. He was a man new to love, in the nobler sense of the word. The exquisite softness in the touch of her lips, the delicious fragrance of her breath, intoxicated him. Again and again he returned the kiss. She drew back; she recovered her self possession with a suddenness and a certainty incomprehensible to a man. From the depths of tenderness she passed to the shallows of frivolity. In her own defence she was almost as superficial as her mother, in less than a moment. "What would Mr. Penrose say if he saw you?" she whispered. "Why do you speak of Penrose? Have you seen him to night?" "Yes, looking sadly out of his element, poor man. I did my best to set him at his ease, because I know you like him." "Dear Stella!" "No, not again. I am speaking seriously now. Mr. Penrose looked at me with a strange kind of interest. I can't describe it. Have you taken him into your confidence?" "He is so devoted, he has such a true interest in me," said Romayne. "I really felt ashamed to treat him like a stranger. On our journey to London, I did own that it was your charming letter which had decided me on returning. I did say I must tell her myself how well she has understood me, and how deeply I feel her kindness. Penrose took my hand in his gentle, considerate way. 'I understand you too,' he said, and that was all that passed between us." "Nothing more since that time?" "Nothing." "Not a word of what we said to each other when we were alone last week in the picture gallery?" "Not a word. I am self tormentor enough to distrust myself even now. God knows I have concealed nothing from you, and yet am I not selfishly thinking of my own happiness, Stella, when I ought to be thinking only of you? You know, my angel, with what a life you must associate yourself if you marry me. Are you really sure that you have love enough and courage enough to be my wife?" She rested her head caressingly on his shoulder, and looked up at him with her charming smile. "How many times must I say it," she asked, "before you will believe me? Once more. I have love enough and courage enough to be your wife, and I knew it, Lewis, the first time I saw you. Will that confession satisfy your scruples? And will you promise never again to doubt yourself or me?" Romayne promised, and sealed the promise, unresisted this time, with a kiss. "When are we to be married?" he whispered. She lifted her head from his shoulder with a sigh. "If I am to answer you honestly," she replied, "I must speak of my mother before I speak of myself." Romayne submitted to the duties of his new position as well as he understood them. "Do you mean that you have told your mother of our engagement?" he said. "In that case, is it my duty or yours I am very ignorant in these matters to consult her wishes? My own idea is that I ought to ask her if she approves of me as her son in law, and that you might then speak to her of the marriage." Stella thought of Romayne's tastes, all in favor of modest retirement, and of her mother's tastes, all in favor of ostentation and display. She frankly owned the result produced in her own mind. "I am afraid to consult my mother about our marriage," she said. Romayne looked astonished. "Do you think Mrs. Eyrecourt will disapprove of it?" he asked. Stella was equally astonished on her side. "Disapprove of it?" she repeated. "I know for certain that my mother will be delighted." "Then where is the difficulty?" There was but one way of definitely answering that question. Stella boldly described her mother's idea of a wedding, including the Archbishop, the 12 bridesmaids in green and gold, and the 100 guests at breakfast in Lord Loring's picture gallery. Romayne's consternation literally deprived him for the moment of the power of speech. To say that he looked at Stella as a prisoner in the condemned cell might have looked at the sheriff announcing the morning of his execution would be to do injustice to the prisoner. He receives his shock without flinching, and, in proof of his composure, celebrates his wedding with the gallows by a breakfast which he will not live to digest. "If you think as your mother does," Romayne began, as soon as he had recovered his self possession, "no opinion of mine shall stand in the way." He could get no further. His vivid imagination saw the Archbishop and the bridesmaids, heard the 100 guests and their dreadful speeches. His voice faltered in spite of himself. Stella eagerly relieved him. "My darling, I don't think as my mother does," she interposed tenderly. "I am sorry to say we have very few sympathies in common. Marriages, as I think, ought to be celebrated as privately as possible. The near and dear relations present, and no one else. If there must be rejoicings and banquets, and hundreds of invitations, let them come when the wedded pair are at home after the honeymoon, beginning life in earnest. These are odd ideas for a woman to have, but they are my ideas, for all that." Romayne's face brightened. "How few women possess your fine sense and your delicacy of feeling!" he exclaimed. "Surely your mother must give way when she hears we are both of one mind about our marriage." Stella knew her mother too well to share the opinion thus expressed. Mrs. Eyrecourt's capacity for holding to her own little ideas, and for persisting, where her social interests were concerned, in trying to insinuate those ideas into the minds of other persons, was a capacity which no resistance, short of absolute brutality, could overcome. She was perfectly capable of worrying Romayne, as well as her daughter, to the utmost limits of human endurance, in the firm conviction that she was bound to convert all heretics of their way of thinking to the orthodox faith in the matter of weddings. Putting this view of the case with all possible delicacy in speaking of her mother, Stella expressed herself plainly enough, nevertheless, to enlighten Romayne. He made another suggestion. "Can we marry privately," he said, "and tell Mrs. Eyrecourt of it afterward?" This essentially masculine solution of the difficulty was at once rejected. Stella was too good a daughter to suffer her mother to be treated with even the appearance of disrespect. "Oh," she said, "think how mortified and distressed my mother would be! She must be present at my marriage." An idea of a compromise occurred to Romayne. "What do you say," he proposed, "to arranging for the marriage privately, and then telling Mrs. Eyrecourt only a day or two beforehand, when it would be too late to send out invitations? If your mother would be disappointed " "She would be angry," Stella interposed. "Very well. Lay all the blame on me. Besides, there might be two other persons present, whom I am sure Mrs. Eyrecourt is always glad to meet. You don't object to Lord and Lady Loring?"
"Object? They are my dearest friends, as well as yours."
"Anyone else, Stella?"
"Anyone, Lewis, whom you like."
"Then I say no one else." "My own love, when may it be? My lawyers can get the settlements ready in a fortnight or less. Will you say in a fortnight?" His arms were round her waist, his lips were touching her lovely neck. She was not a woman to take refuge in the commonplace coquetries of the sex.
"Yes," she said softly, "if you wish it."
She rose and withdrew herself from him.
"For my sake, we must not be here together any longer, Louis."
As she spoke, the music in the ballroom ceased. Stella ran out of the conservatory. The first person she encountered on returning to the reception room was Father Benwell. End of chapter 2. Read by Lars Rolander. The Story, Book the Second, Chapter 3 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the Second, Chapter 3. The End of the Ball. The priest's long journey did not appear to have fatigued him. He was as cheerful and as polite as ever, and so paternally attentive to Stella that it was quite impossible for her to pass him with a formal bow. "I have come all the way from Devonshire," he said. "The train has been behind time as usual, and I am one of the late arrivals in consequence. I miss some familiar faces at this delightful party. Mr. Romayne, for instance. Perhaps he is not one of the guests?"
"Oh, yes."
"Has he gone away?"
"No, not that I know of."
The tone of her replies warned Father Benwell to let Romayne be. He tried another name. "And Arthur Penrose?" he inquired next.
"I think Mr. Penrose has left us."
As she answered, she looked toward Lady Loring. The hostess was the center of a circle of ladies and gentlemen. Before she was at liberty, Father Benwell might take his departure. Stella resolved to make the attempt for herself which she had asked Lady Loring to make for her. It was better to try, and to be defeated, than not to try at all.
"I asked Mr. Penrose what part of Devonshire you were visiting," she resumed, assuming her more gracious manner. "I know something myself of the north coast, especially the neighborhood of Clovelly." Not the faintest change passed over the priest's face. His fatherly smile had never been in a better state of preservation.
"Isn't it a charming place?" he said with enthusiasm. "Clovelly is the most remarkable and most beautiful village in England. I have so enjoyed my little holiday. Excursions by sea and excursions by land, you know I feel quite young again."
He lifted his eyebrows playfully, and rubbed his plump hands one over the other with such an intolerable, innocent air of enjoyment that Stella positively hated him. She felt her capacity for self restraint failing her. Under the influence of strong emotion, her thoughts lost their customary discipline. In attempting to fathom Father Benwell, she was conscious of having undertaken a task which required more pliable moral qualities than she possessed. To her own unutterable annoyance, she was at loss what to say next. At that critical moment her mother appeared, eager for news of the conquest of Romayne.
"My dear child, how pale you look!" said Mrs. Eyrecourt. "Come with me directly. You must have a glass of wine." This dexterous device for entrapping Stella into a private conversation failed.
"Not now, mamma, thank you," she said.
Father Benwell, on the point of discreetly withdrawing, stopped and looked at Mrs. Eyrecourt with an appearance of respectful interest. As things were, it might not have been worth his while to take the trouble of discovering her. But when she actually placed herself in his way, the chance of turning Mrs. Eyrecourt to useful account was not a chance to be neglected. "Your mother?" he said to Stella. "I should feel honored if you will introduce me."
Having, not very willingly, performed the ceremony of presentation, Stella drew back a little. She had no desire to take any part in the conversation that might follow, but she had her own reasons for waiting near enough to hear it. In the meanwhile, Mrs. Eyrecourt turned on her inexhaustible flow of small talk with her customary facility. No distinction of persons troubled her, no convictions of any sort stood in her way. She was equally ready, provided she met him in good society, to make herself agreeable to a Puritan or a Papist. "Delighted to make your acquaintance, Father Benwell. Surely I met you at that delightful evening at the Duke's. I mean, when we welcomed the Cardinal back from Rome. Dear old man! If one may speak so familiarly of a prince of the Church. How charmingly he bears his new honors! Such patriarchal simplicity, as every one remarked. Have you seen him lately?" The idea of the order to which he belonged feeling any special interest in a cardinal, except when they made him of some use to them, privately amused Father Benwell. "How wise the Church was," he thought, "in inventing a spiritual aristocracy! Even this fool of a woman is impressed by it." His spoken reply was true to his assumed character as one of the inferior clergy. "Poor priests like me, madam, see but little of princes of the Church in the houses of dukes." Saying this with the most becoming humility, he turned the talk in a more productive direction, before Mrs. Eyrecourt could proceed with her recollections of the evening at the Duke's. "Your charming daughter and I have been talking about Clovelly," he continued. "I have just been spending a little holiday in that delightful place. It was a surprise to me, Mrs. Eyrecourt, to see so many really beautiful country seats in the neighborhood. I was particularly struck you know it, of course by Beaupark House." Mrs. Eyrecourt's little twinging eyes suddenly became still and steady. It was only for a moment, but that trifling change boded ill for the purpose which the priest had in view. Even the wits of a fool can be quickened by contact with the world. For many years Mrs. Eyrecourt had held her place in society, acting under an intensely selfish sense of her own interests, fortified by those cunning instincts which grow best in a barren intellect. Perfectly unworthy of being trusted with secrets which only concerned other people, this frivolous creature could be the unassailable guardian of secrets which concerned herself. The instant the priest referred indirectly to Winterfield, by speaking of Beaupark House, her instincts warned her, as if in words, "Be careful, for Stella's sake." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Eyrecourt, "I know Beaupark House. But may I make a confession?" she added, with her sweetest smile. Father Benwell caught her tone with his customary tact. "A confession at a ball is a novelty, even in my experience," he answered, with his sweetest smile. "How good of you to encourage me!" proceeded Mrs. Eyrecourt. "No, thank you, I don't want to sit down. My confession won't take long, and I really must give that poor pale daughter of mine a glass of wine. A student of human nature like you, they say all priests are students of human nature, accustomed, of course, to be consulted in difficulties, and to hear real confessions, must know that we poor women are sadly subject to whims and caprices. We can't resist them as men do, and the dear good men generally makes allowances for us. Well, do you know that place of Mr. Winterfield's is one of my caprices? Oh, dear, I speak carelessly. I ought to have said the place represents one of my caprices. In short, Father Benwell, Beaupark House is perfectly odious to me, and I think Clovelly the most overrated place in the world. I haven't the least reason to give, but so it is. Excessively foolish of me. It's like hysterics. I can't help it. I'm sure you will forgive me. There isn't a place on the habitable globe that I'm not ready to feel interested in, except detestable Devonshire. I'm sorry you went there. The next time you have a holiday, take my advice. Try the Continent." "I should like it of all things," said Father Benwell, "only I don't speak French. Allow me to get Mrs. Eyrecourt a glass of wine." He spoke with the most perfect temper and tranquillity. Having paid his little attention to Stella, and having relieved her of the empty glass, he took his leave with a parting request thoroughly characteristic of the man. "Are you staying in town, Mrs. Eyrecourt?" he asked. "Oh, of course, at the height of the season." "May I have the honor of calling on you, and talking a little more about the Continent?" If he had said it in so many words, he could hardly have informed Mrs. Eyrecourt more plainly that he thoroughly understood her, and that he meant to try again. Strong in the worldly training of half a lifetime, she at once informed him of her address, with the complimentary phrases proper to the occasion. "5 o'clock tea on Wednesdays, Father Benwell. Don't forget." The moment he was gone, she drew her daughter into a quiet corner. "Don't be frightened, Stella. That sly old person has some interest in trying to find out about Winterfield. Do you know why?" "Indeed, I don't, mamma. I hate him." "Oh, hush, hush! Hate him as much as you like, but always be civil to him. Tell me, have you been in the conservatory with Romayne?"
"Yes."
"All going well?"
"Yes."
"My sweet child! Dear, dear me! The wine has done you no good. You're as pale as ever. Is it that priest? Oh, pooh, pooh! Leave Father Benwell to me."
End of chapter 3. Read by Lars Rolander. Book the Second, Chapter 4 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the Second, Chapter 4. In the Small Hours. When Stella left the conservatory, the attraction of the ball for Romayne was at an end. He went back to his rooms at the hotel. Penrose was waiting to speak to him. Romayne noticed signs of suppressed agitation in his secretary's face. "Has anything happened?" he inquired. "Nothing of any importance," Penrose answered in sad, subdued tones. "I only wanted to ask you for leave of absence." "Certainly. Is it for a long time?" Penrose hesitated. "You have a new life opening before you," he said. "If your experience of that life is, as I hope and pray it may be, a happy one, you will need me no longer. We may not meet again." His voice began to tremble. He could say no more. "Not meet again?" Romayne repeated. "My dear Penrose, if you forget how many happy days I owe to your companionship, my memory is to be trusted. Do you really know what my new life is to be? Shall I tell you what I have said to Stella to night?" Penrose lifted his hand with a gesture of entreaty. "Not a word!" he said eagerly. "Do me one more kindness. Leave me to be prepared, as I am prepared, for the change that is to come, without any confidence on your part to enlighten me further. Don't think me ungrateful. I have reasons for saying what I have just said. I cannot mention what they are. I can only tell you they are serious reasons. You have spoken of my devotion to you. If you wish to reward me 100-fold more than I deserve, bear in mind our conversations on religion, and keep the books I ask you to read as gifts from a friend who loves you with his whole heart. No new duties that you can undertake are incompatible with the higher interests of your soul. Think of me sometimes. When I leave you, I go back to a lonely life. My poor heart is full of your brotherly kindness at this last moment, when I may be saying good by forever. And what is my one consolation? What helps me to bear my hard lot? The faith that I hold. Remember that, Romayne. If there comes a time of sorrow in the future, remember that." Romayne was more than surprised, he was shocked.
"Why must you leave me?" he asked. "It is best for you and for her," said Penrose, "that I should withdraw myself from your new life." He held out his hand. Romayne refused to let him go. "Penrose," he said, "I can't match your resignation. Give me something to look forward to. I must and will see you again." Penrose smiled sadly. "You know that my career in life depends wholly on my superiors," he answered. "But if I am still in England, and if you have sorrows in the future that I can share and alleviate, only let me know it. There is nothing within the compass of my power which I will not do for your sake. God bless and prosper you. Good by." In spite of his fortitude, the tears rose in his eyes. He hurried out of the room. Romayne sat down at his writing table, and hid his face in his hands. He had entered the room with the bright image of Stella in his mind. The image had faded from it now. The grief that was in him not even the beloved woman could share. His thoughts were fully with the brave and patient Christian who had left him, the true man, whose spotless integrity no evil influence could corrupt. By what inscrutable fatality do some men find their way into spheres that are unworthy of them? Oh, Penrose, if the priests of your order were all like you, how easily I should be converted! These were Romayne's thoughts in the stillness of the first hours of the morning. The books of which his lost friend had spoken were close by him on the table. He opened one of them and turned to a page marked by pencil lines. His sensitive nature was troubled to its inmost depths. The confession of that faith which had upheld Penrose was before him in words. The impulse was strong in him to read those words and think over them again. He trimmed his lamp and bent his mind on his book. While he was still reading, the ball at Lord Loring's house came to its end. Stella and Lady Loring were alone together, talking of him, before they retired to their rooms. "Forgive me for owning it plainly," said Lady Loring. "I think you and your mother are a little too ready to suspect Father Benwell without any discoverable cause. Thousands of people go to Clovelly, and Beaupark House is one of the show places in the neighborhood. Is there a little Protestant prejudice in this new idea of yours?" Stella made no reply. She seemed to be lost in her own thoughts. Lady Loring went on. "I am open to conviction, my dear, if you will only tell me what interest Father Benwell can have in knowing about you and Winterfield." Stella suddenly looked up. "Let us speak of another person," she said. "I own I don't like Father Benwell. As you know, Romayne has concealed nothing from me. Ought I to have any concealments from him? Ought I not to tell him about Winterfield?" Lady Loring started. "You astonish me," she said. "What right has Romayne to know it?" "What right have I to keep it a secret from him?" "My dear Stella, if you had been in any way to blame in that miserable matter, I should be the last person in the world to advise you to keep it a secret. But you are innocent of all blame. No man, not even the man who is soon to be your husband, has a right to know what you have so unjustly suffered. Think of the humiliation of even speaking of it to Romayne." "I daren't think of it!" cried Stella passionately. "But if it is my duty—" "It is your duty to consider the consequences," Lady Loring interposed. "You don't know how such things sometimes rankle in a man's mind. He may be perfectly willing to do justice, and yet there may be moments when he would doubt if you had told him the whole truth. I speak with the experience of a married woman. Don't place yourself in that position toward your husband, if you wish for a happy married life." Stella was not quite convinced yet. "Suppose Romayne finds it out?" she said. "He can't possibly find it out. I detest Winterfield, but let us do him justice. He is no fool. He has his position in the world to keep up, and that is enough of itself to close his lips. And as for others, there are only 3 people now in England who could betray you. I suppose you can trust your mother and Lord Loring and me." It was needless to answer such a question as that. Before Stella could speak again, Lord Loring's voice was audible outside the door. "What, talking still?" he exclaimed. "Not in bed yet?" "Come in," cried his wife. "Let us hear what my husband thinks," she said to Stella. Lord Loring listened with the closest attention while the subject under discussion was communicated to him. When the time came to give his opinion, he sided unhesitatingly with his wife. "If the fault was yours, even in the slightest degree," he said to Stella, "Romayne would have a right to be taken into your confidence. But, my dear child, we who know the truth know you to be a pure and innocent woman. You go to Romayne in every way worthy of him, and you know that he loves you. If you did tell him that miserable story, he could only pity you. Do you want to be pitied?" Those last unanswerable words brought the debate to an end. From that moment the subject was dropped. There was still one other person among the guests at the ball who was waking in the small hours of the morning. Father Benwell, wrapped comfortably in his dressing gown, was too hard at work on his correspondence to think of his bed. With one exception, all the letters that he had written thus far were closed, directed, and stamped for the post. The letter that he kept open he was now engaged in reconsidering and correcting. It was addressed as usual to the secretary of the order at Rome, and, when it had undergone the final revision, it contained these lines: "My last letter informed you of Romayne's return to London and to Miss Eyrecourt. Let me entreat our reverend brethren to preserve perfect tranquillity of mind, in spite of this circumstance. The owner of Vange Abbey is not married yet. If patience and perseverance on my part win their fair reward, Miss Eyrecourt shall never be his wife. But let me not conceal the truth. In the uncertain future that lies before us, I have no one to depend on but myself. Penrose is no longer to be trusted, and the exertions of the agent to whom I committed my inquiries are exertions that have failed. I will dispose of the case of Penrose first. The zeal with which this young man has undertaken the work of conversion entrusted to him has, I regret to say, not been fired by devotion to the interests of the Church, but by a dog-like affection for Romayne. Without waiting for my permission, Penrose has revealed himself in his true character as a priest. And more than this, he has not only refused to observe the proceedings of Romayne and Miss Eyrecourt, he has deliberately closed his ears to the confidence which Romayne wished to repose in him, on the ground that I might have ordered him to repeat that confidence to me. To what use can we put this poor fellow's ungovernable sense of honor and gratitude? Under present circumstances, he is clearly of little use to us. I have therefore given him time to think. That is to say, I have not opposed his leaving London to assist in the spiritual care of a country district. It will be a question for the future whether we may not turn his enthusiasm to good account in a foreign mission. However, as it is always possible that his influence may still be of use to us, I venture to suggest keeping him within our reach until Romayne's conversion has actually taken place. Don't suppose that the present separation between them is final. I will answer for their meeting again. I may now proceed to the failure of my agent, and to the course of action that I have adopted in consequence. The investigations appear to have definitely broken down at the seaside village of Clovelly, in the neighborhood of Mr. Winterfield's country seat. Knowing that I could depend upon the information which associated this gentleman with Miss Eyrecourt, under compromising circumstances of some sort, I decided on seeing Mr. Winterfield and judging for myself. The agent's report informed me that the person who had finally baffled his inquiries was an aged Catholic priest, long resident at Clovelly. His name is Newbliss, and he is much respected among the Catholic gentry in that part of Devonshire. After due consideration, I obtained a letter of introduction to my reverend colleague, and traveled to Clovelly, telling my friends here that I was taking a little holiday in the interests of my health. I found Father Newbliss a venerable and reticent son of the Church, with one weak point, however, to work on, which was entirely beyond the reach of the otherwise astute person charged with my inquiries. My reverend friend is a scholar, and is inordinately proud of his learning. I am a scholar too. In that capacity, I first found my way to his sympathies, and then gently encouraged his pride. The result will appear in certain discoveries, which I number as follows: 1. The events which connect Mr. Winterfield with Miss Eyrecourt happened about 2 years since, and had their beginning at Beaupark House. 2. At this period Miss Eyrecourt and her mother were staying at Beaupark House. The general impression in the neighborhood was that Mr. Winterfield and Miss Eyrecourt were engaged to be married. 3. Not long afterward, Miss Eyrecourt and her mother surprised the neighborhood by suddenly leaving Beaupark House. Their destination was supposed to be London. 4. Mr. Winterfield himself next left his country seat for the Continent. His exact destination was not mentioned to anyone. The steward soon afterward dismissed all the servants, and the house was left empty for more than a year. 5. At the end of that time, Mr. Winterfield returned alone to Beaupark House, and told nobody how or where he had passed the long interval of his absence. 6. Mr. Winterfield remains to the present day an unmarried man. Having arrived at these preliminary discoveries, it was time to try what I could make of Mr. Winterfield next. Among the other good things which this gentleman has inherited is a magnificent library collected by his father. That one learned man should take another learned man to see the books was a perfectly natural proceeding. My introduction to the master of the house followed my introduction to the library almost as a matter of course. I am about to surprise you, as I was myself surprised. In all my long experience, Mr. Winterfield is, I think, the most fascinating person I ever met with. Genial, unassuming manners, a prepossessing personal appearance, a sweet temper, a quaint humor delightfully accompanied by natural refinement, such are the characteristic qualities of the man from whom I myself saw Miss Eyrecourt, accidentally meeting him in public, recoil with dismay and disgust. It is absolutely impossible to look at him, and to believe him to be capable of a cruel or dishonorable action. I never was so puzzled in my life. You may be inclined to think that I am misled by a false impression, derived from the gratifying welcome that I received as a friend of Father Newbliss. I will not appeal to my knowledge of human nature. I will refer to the unanswerable evidence of Mr. Winterfield's poor neighbors. Wherever I went in the village, or out of it, if I mentioned his name, I produced a universal outburst of admiration and gratitude. There never was such a friend to poor people, and there never can be such another to the end of the world. Such was a fisherman's description of him, and the one cry of all the men and women near us answered, "That's the truth." And yet there is something wrong, for this plain reason, that there is something to be concealed in the past lives of Mr. Winterfield and Miss Eyrecourt. Under these perplexing circumstances, what use have I made of my opportunities? I am going to surprise you again. I have mentioned Romayne's name to Mr. Winterfield, and I have ascertained that they are so far perfect strangers to one another, and that is all. The little incident of mentioning Romayne arose out of my examination of the library. I discovered certain old volumes, which may one day be of use to him, if he continues his contemplated work on the origin of religions. Hearing me express myself to this effect, Mr. Winterfield replied with the readiest kindness. "I can't compare myself to my excellent father," he said, "but I have at least inherited his respect for the writers of books. My library is a treasure which I hold in trust for the interests of literature. Pray say so from me to your friend Mr. Romayne." And what does this amount to? You will ask. My reverend friend, it offers me an opportunity in the future of bringing Romayne and Winterfield together. Do you see the complications which may ensue? If I can put no other difficulty in Miss Eyrecourt's way, I think there is fruitful promise of a scandal of some kind arising out of the introduction to each other of those two men. You will agree with me that a scandal may prove a valuable obstacle in the way of a marriage. Mr. Winterfield has kindly invited me to call on him when he is next in London. I may then have opportunities of putting questions which I could not venture to ask on a short acquaintance. In the meantime, I have obtained another introduction since my return to town. I have been presented to Miss Eyrecourt's mother, and I am invited to drink tea with her on Wednesday. My next letter may tell you what Penrose ought to have discovered, whether Romayne has been already entrapped into a marriage engagement or not. Farewell for the present. Remind the Reverend Fathers, with my respects, that I possess one of the valuable qualities of an Englishman. I never know when I am beaten. End of chapter 4. Read by Lars Rolander.
Book the Third, Chapter 1 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the Third, Chapter 1. The Honeymoon. More than 6 weeks had passed. The wedded lovers were still enjoying their honeymoon at Vange Abbey. Some offense had been given, not only to Mrs. Eyrecourt, but to friends of her way of thinking, by the strictly private manner in which the marriage had been celebrated. The event took everybody by surprise when the customary advertisement appeared in the newspapers. Foreseeing the unfavorable impression that might be produced in some quarters, Stella had pleaded for a timely retreat to the seclusion of Romayne's country house. The will of the bride being as usual the bridegroom's law, to Vange they retired accordingly. On one lovely moonlight night, early in July, Mrs. Romayne left her husband on the Belvidere, described in Major Hynd's narrative, to give the housekeeper certain instructions relating to the affairs of the household. Half an hour later, as she was about to ascend again to the top of the house, one of the servants informed her that the master had just left the Belvidere and had gone into his study. Crossing the inner hall on her way to the study, Stella noticed an unopened letter, addressed to Romayne, lying on a table in a corner. He had probably laid it aside and forgotten it. She entered his room with the letter in her hand. The only light was a reading lamp, with the shade so lowered that the corners of the study were left in obscurity. In one of these corners Romayne was dimly visible, sitting with his head sunk on his breast. He never moved when Stella opened the door. At first she thought he might be asleep. "Do I disturb you, Lewis?" she asked softly. "No, my dear." There was a change in the tone of his voice, which his wife's quick ear detected. "I am afraid you are not well," she said anxiously. "I am a little tired after our long ride to day. Do you want to go back to the Belvidere?" "Not without you. Shall I leave you to rest here?" He seemed not to hear the question. There he sat, with his head hanging down, the shadowy counterfeit of an old man. In her anxiety, Stella approached him and put her hand caressingly on his head. It was burning hot. "Oh!" she cried, "you are ill, and you are trying to hide it from me!" He put his arm round her waist and made her sit on his knee. "Nothing is the matter with me," he said, with an uneasy laugh. "What have you got in your hand? A letter?" "Yes, addressed to you, and not opened yet." He took it out of her hand, and threw it carelessly on a sofa near him. "Never mind that now. Let us talk. He paused and kissed her before he went on. "My darling, I think you must be getting tired of Vange?"
Oh, no! I can be happy anywhere with you, and especially at Vange. You don't know how this noble house interests me, and how I admire the glorious country all round it."
He was not convinced. "Vange is very dull," he said obstinately, "and your friends will be wanting to see you. Have you heard from your mother lately?"
No, I am surprised she has not written.
"She has not forgiven us for getting married so quietly," he went on. "We had better go back to London and make our peace with her. Don't you want to see the house my aunt left me at Highgate?" Stella sighed. The society of the man she loved was society enough for her. Was he getting tired of his wife already?
I will go with you wherever you like.
She said those words in tones of sad submission, and gently got up from his knee. He rose also, and took from the sofa the letter which he had thrown on it. "Let us see what our friends say," he resumed. "The address is in Loring's handwriting." As he approached the table on which the lamp was burning, she noticed that he moved with a languor that was new in her experience of him. He sat down and opened the letter. She watched him with an anxiety which had now become intensified to suspicion. The shade of the lamp still prevented her from seeing his face plainly. "Just what I told you," he said. "The Lorings want to know when they are to see us in London. And your mother says she feels like that character in Shakespeare who was cut by his own daughters. Read it." He handed her the letter. In taking it, she contrived to touch the lampshade as if by accident, and tilted it so that the full flow of the light fell on him. He started back, but not before she had seen the ghastly pallor on his face. She had not only heard it from Lady Loring; she knew from his own unreserved confession to her what that startling change really meant. In an instant she was on her knees at his feet.
Oh, my darling, she cried, it was cruel to keep that secret from your wife. You have heard it again.
She was too irresistibly beautiful at that moment to be reproved. He gently raised her from the floor, and owned the truth. "Yes," he said, "I heard it after you left me on the Belvedere, just as I heard it on another moonlight night when Major Hynd was here with me. Our return to this house is perhaps the cause. I don't complain. I have had a long release." She threw her arms round his neck. "We will leave Vange to morrow," she said. It was firmly spoken, but her heart sank as the words passed her lips. Vange Abbey had been the scene of the most unalloyed happiness in her life. What destiny was waiting for her when she returned to London? End of chapter 1. Read by Lars Rolander. Book the Third, Chapter 2, of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the Third, Chapter 2. Events at 10 Acres. There was no obstacle to the speedy departure of Romayne and his wife from Vange Abbey. The villa at Highgate, called 10 Acres Lodge, in allusion to the measurement of the grounds surrounding the house, had been kept in perfect order by the servants of the late Lady Berrick, now in the employment of her nephew. On the morning after their arrival at the villa, Stella sent a note to her mother. The same afternoon Mrs. Eyrecourt arrived at 10 Acres, on her way to a garden party. Finding the house, to her great relief, a modern building, supplied with all the newest comforts and luxuries, she at once began to plan a grand party, in celebration of the return of the bride and bridegroom. "I don't wish to praise myself," Mrs. Eyrecourt said, "but if ever there was a forgiving woman, I am that person. We will say no more, Stella, about your truly contemptible wedding. 5 people all together, including ourselves and the Lorings. A grand ball will set you right with society, and that is the one thing needful. Tea and coffee, my dear Romayne, in your study. Coates' quadrille band, the supper from Gunter's, the grounds illuminated with colored lamps, Tyrolese singers among the trees, relieved by military music, and if there are any African or other savages now in London, there is room enough in these charming grounds for encampments, dances, squaws, scalps, and all the rest of it, to end in a blaze of fireworks." A sudden fit of coughing seized her, and stopped the further enumeration of attractions at the contemplated ball. Stella had observed that her mother looked unusually worn and haggard through the disguises of paint and powder. This was not an uncommon result of Mrs. Eyrecourt's devotion to the demands of society, but the cough was something new, as a symptom of exhaustion. "I am afraid, mamma, you have been overexerting yourself," said Stella. "You go to too many parties." "Nothing of the sort, my dear. I am strong as a horse. The other night I was waiting for the carriage in a draught. One of the most perfect private concerts of the season, ending with a delightfully naughty little French play, and I caught a slight cold. A glass of water is all I want. Thank you. Romayne, you are looking shockingly serious and severe. Our ball will cheer you. If you would only make a bonfire of all those horrid books, you don't know how it would improve your spirits. Dearest Stella, I will come and lunch here to morrow. You are within such a nice, easy drive from town. And I'll bring my visiting book, and settle about the invitations and the day. Oh, dear me, how late it is! I have nearly an hour's drive before I get to my garden party. Good by, my turtle doves, good by." She was stopped on the way to her carriage by another fit of coughing, but she still persisted in making light of it. "I'm as strong as a horse," she repeated, as soon as she could speak, and skipped into the carriage like a young girl. "Your mother is killing herself," said Romayne. "If I could persuade her to stay with us a little while," Stella suggested, "the rest and quiet might do wonders for her. Would you object to it, Lewis?" "My darling, I object to nothing, except giving a ball and burning my books. If your mother will yield on these 2 points, my house is entirely at her disposal." He spoke playfully. He looked his best since he had separated himself from the painful associations that were now connected with Vange Abbey. Had the torment of the voice been left far away in Yorkshire? Stella shrank from approaching the subject in her husband's presence, knowing that it must remind him of the fatal duel. To her surprise, Romayne himself referred to the General's family. "I have written to Hynd," he began. "Do you mind his dining with us to day?" "Of course not." "I want to hear if he has anything to tell me about those French ladies. He undertook to see them in your absence, and to ascertain—" He was unable to overcome his reluctance to pronounce the next words. Stella was quick to understand what he meant. She finished the sentence for him. "Yes," he said. "I wanted to hear how the boy is getting on, and if there is any hope of curing him. Is it—" he trembled as he put the question—"is it hereditary madness?" Feeling the serious importance of concealing the truth, Stella only replied that she had hesitated to ask if there was a taint of madness in the family. "I suppose," she added, "you would not like to see the boy, and judge of his chances of recovery for yourself?" "You suppose!" he burst out with sudden anger. "You might be sure! The bare idea of seeing him turns me cold. Oh, when shall I forget? When shall I forget? Who spoke of him first? He said with renewed irritability, after a moment of silence. You or I? It was my fault, love. He is so harmless and so gentle, and he has such a sweet face. I thought it might soothe you to see him. Forgive me, we will never speak of him again. Have you any notes for me to copy? You know, Louis, I'm your secretary now." So she led Romayne away to his study and his books. When Major Hynd arrived, she contrived to be the first to see him. "Say as little as possible about the General's widow and her son," she whispered. The Major understood her. "Don't be uneasy, Mrs. Romayne," he answered. "I know your husband well enough to know what you mean. Besides, the news I bring is good news." Romayne came in before he could speak more particularly. When the servants had left the room after dinner, the Major made his report. "I am going to agreeably surprise you," he began. "All responsibility toward the General's family is taken off our hands. The ladies are on their way back to France." Stella was instantly reminded of one of the melancholy incidents associated with her visit to Camp's Hill. "Madame Marillac spoke of a brother of hers who disapproved of the marriage," she said. "Has he forgiven her?" "That is exactly what he has done, Mrs. Romayne. Naturally enough, he felt the disgrace of his sister's marriage to such a man as the General. Only the other day he heard for the first time that she was a widow, and he at once traveled to England. I bade them good bye yesterday, most happily reunited, on their journey home again. Ah, I thought you would be glad, Mrs. Romayne, to hear that the poor widow's troubles are over. Her brother is rich enough to place them all in easy circumstances. He is as good a fellow as ever lived." "Have you seen him?" Stella asked eagerly. "I have been with him to the asylum." "Does the boy go back to France?" "No. We took the place by surprise, and saw for ourselves how well conducted it was. The boy has taken a strong liking to the proprietor, a bright, cheerful old man, who is teaching him some of our English games, and has given him a pony to ride on. He burst out crying, poor creature, at the idea of going away, and his mother burst out crying at the idea of leaving him. It was a melancholy scene. You know what a good mother is; no sacrifice is too great for her. The boy stays at the asylum, on the chance that his healthier and happier life there may help to cure him. By the way, Romayne, his uncle desires me to thank you." "And you didn't tell the uncle my name?" "Don't alarm yourself. He is a gentleman, and when I told him I was pledged to secrecy, he made but one inquiry. He asked if you were a rich man. I told him you had 18,000 a year." "Well?" "Well, he set that matter right between us, with perfect taste. He said, 'I cannot presume to offer repayment to a person so wealthy. We gratefully accept our obligation to our kind unknown friend. For the future, however, my nephew's expenses must be paid from my purse.' Of course, I could only agree to that. From time to time, the mother is to hear, and I am to hear, how the boy goes on. Or, if you like, Romayne, now that the General's family has left England, I don't see why the proprietor might not make his report directly to yourself." "No," Romayne rejoined positively. "Let things remain as they are." "Very well. I can send you any letters that I may receive from the asylum. Will you give us some music, Mrs. Romayne? Not to night? Then let us go to the billiard room. And as I am the worst of bad players, I will ask you to help me to beat your accomplished husband." On the afternoon of the next day, Mrs. Eyrecourt's maid arrived at Ten Acres with a note from her mistress. "Dearest Stella, Matilda must bring you my excuses for today. I don't in the least understand it, but I seem to have turned lazy. It is most ridiculous. I really cannot get out of bed.
Perhaps I did do just a little too much yesterday. The opera after the garden party, and a ball after the opera, and this tiresome cough all night after the ball. Quite a series, isn't it? Make my apologies to our dear dismal Romayne. And if you drive out this afternoon, come and have a chat with me. Your affectionate mother, Emily Eyrecourt. P.S. You know what a fidget Matilda is. If she talks about me, don't believe a word she says to you.
Stella turned to the maid with a sinking heart.
Is my mother very ill? She asked.
So ill, ma'am, that I begged and prayed her to let me send for a doctor. You know what my mistress is. If you would please to use your influence.
I will order the carriage instantly, and take you back with me.
Before she dressed to go out, Stella showed the letter to her husband. He spoke with perfect kindness and sympathy, but he did not conceal that he shared his wife's apprehensions. "Go at once," were his last words to her, "and if I can be of any use, send for me." It was late in the evening before Stella returned. She brought sad news. The physician consulted told her plainly that the neglected cough and the constant fatigue had together made the case a serious one. He declined to say that there was any absolute danger as yet, or any necessity for her remaining with her mother at night. The experience of the next 24 hours at most would enable him to speak positively. In the meantime, the patient insisted that Stella should return to her husband. Even under the influence of opiates, Mrs. Eyrecourt was still drowsily equal to herself.
You are a fidget, my dear, and Matilda is a fidget. I can't have two of you at my bedside. Good night.
Stella stooped over her and kissed her. She whispered,
3 weeks' notice, remember, for the party.
By the next evening the malady had assumed so formidable an aspect that the doctor had his doubts of the patient's chance of recovery. With her husband's full approval, Stella remained night and day at her mother's bedside. Thus, in a little more than a month from the day of his marriage, Romayne was for the time a lonely man again. The illness of Mrs. Eyrecourt was unexpectedly prolonged. There were intervals during which her vigorous constitution rallied and resisted the progress of the disease. On these occasions, Stella was able to return to her husband for a few hours, subject always to a message which recalled her to her mother when the chances of life or death appeared to be equally balanced. Romayne's one resource was in his books and his pen. For the first time since his union with Stella, he opened the portfolios in which Penrose had collected the first introductory chapters of his historical work. Almost at every page, the familiar handwriting of his secretary and friend met his view. It was a new trial to his resolution to be working alone. Never had he felt the absence of Penrose as he felt it now. He missed the familiar face, the quiet, pleasant voice, and, more than both, the ever welcome sympathy with his work. Stella had done all that a wife could do to fill the vacant place, and her husband's fondness had accepted the effort as adding another charm to the lovely creature who had opened a new life to him. But where is the woman who can intimately associate herself with the hard brain work of a man devoted to an absorbing intellectual pursuit? She can love him, admire him, serve him, believe in him beyond all other men, but, in spite of exceptions which only prove the rule, she is out of her place when she enters the study while the pen is in his hand. More than once, when he was at work, Romayne closed the page bitterly. The sad thought came to him, "Oh, if I only had Penrose here!" Even other friends were not available as a resource in the solitary evening hours. Lord Loring was absorbed in social and political engagements, and Major Hynd, true to the principle of getting away as often as possible from his disagreeable wife and his ugly children, had once more left London. One day, while Mrs. Eyrecourt still lay between life and death, Romayne found his historical labors suspended by the want of a certain volume which it was absolutely necessary to consult. He had mislaid the references written for him by Penrose, and he was at loss to remember whether the book was in the British Museum, in the Bodleian Library, or in the Bibliothèque at Paris. In this emergency, a letter to his former secretary would furnish him with the information that he required. But he was ignorant of Penrose's present address. The Lorings might possibly know it, so to the Lorings he resolved to apply. End of chapter 2. Read by Lars Rolander.